Hello everybody, welcome to the second half of Introduction to Philosophy, Knowledge, and Reality. I hope everybody is doing well. This half of the class is going to focus on metaphysical and epistemological questions, dealing with different topics that we'll be looking at, the first of which is the philosophy of mind. Now with the philosophy of mind, there are a couple initial questions that we should go over. First is, what exactly is your mind? We will be discussing the difference between the mind and the brain, and really wondering if the mind is different from or the same as the brain. If it is different, where is it? Where does your mind reside? Does it reside within your brain? Is it more embodied within every aspect of your being? Can we relate it to something like a soul? And why is it that you think that your mind and brain are separate or different? Or why is it that you think that your mind is located in the brain? These are questions that we're going to be focusing on this week, in addition to a number of others moving forward. So some of the basic problems with the philosophy of mind and understanding what our mind is that it seems linked heavily with the brain. Our brain seems to be important when it deals with what the mind is, and that our mind supports this cognition. It supports consciousness. When we have memories or beliefs, when we feel certain emotions or have certain perceptual experiences, these things are very vivid to us. We're able to do them in our mind or brain, and it's not quite clear what exactly is going on when we do this and what this mind is that's really solving for problems or anticipating events. And so it's going to be important moving forward that we really understand the qualities and characteristics of a mind versus the qualities and characteristics of a brain. And it's going to be pretty important moving forward that we do not confuse the two terms, mind and brain, because in certain aspects they're going to be incredibly different. So when we deal with substance dualism for this lecture, you'll see that the mind and brain are two very different things. Later on, however, we might come to conclude that the mind is in fact the brain. And so it's important to not conflate these terms just yet, and really try to understand the different qualities and characteristics of each. And so when we think of the mind dealing with these anticipations and emotions, images, memories, beliefs, things like that, how can this lumpy, soggy, gray, meaty body give rise to such vivid images, to the experiences and feelings that we typically associate with the body? How is it that a purely substance body, a brain, this piece of gray matter, give rise to or constitutes or sustains that level of consciousness? It's not really clear, and we don't really see this type of thing happen in our daily lives, where just basic pieces of matter create something so much more. In addition, we also need to think of, really, if the brain and the mind are different, how does the mind interact with the body? If your mind and body are different, then the mind must interact with the body, because we're going to see that a lot in nature, a lot in science, when certain things happen to the brain, for instance, when certain things happen to the body, it affects how the mind works. Similarly, when we think certain things, when our mind is working, it often affects how we act and behave, which is a very bodily phenomenon. And so how is it that the mind interacts with the body, or the body interacts with the mind? Again, thinking about the brain, this soggy piece of meat, and it constituting my complex feelings of love or hate or envy. It seems a bit weird, and these are going to be things that we're going to discuss in the coming lectures. And so the first perspective that we're going to look at is that of dualism. And with dualism, it's essentially the idea that the brain and the body, the brain and the mind are two very different things, and we'll never really be able to explain the mind by looking at the brain. So no matter how much scientific evidence we gather about the mind, about the brain, no matter how much scientific technology increases our ability to know about the brain, we're still not going to know anything about the mind solely by looking at the physical brain. Instead, the mind is its own separate thing. It's a different kind of substance. And this is really where dualism comes into play, this idea of substance dualism. There are substances in the world that are physical, and there are substances in the world that are not physical. And so the mind and body being two distinct things, we see have two different sets of characteristics, two different sets of qualities. When we think of the body as this physical, soggy brain, we often notice that it's located in space and time. It has a mass and a weight and a size. But when we think of the mind, we think of it in terms of it not being physical. When I have a belief about something, that belief is not necessarily spatially located. There's no weight or mass to the belief. There may be a part of the brain, such as the memory, that houses certain memories, such as my thinking or thought of John Wayne movies versus my thinking or thoughts of movies that Donald Trump has appeared in. Now, to suggest that the John Wayne thoughts in my head are to the left and up from the Donald Trump thoughts is a bit weird. The mind is where mental states occur. It's where the experiences and thoughts take place. It's not somewhere where we can find it and grasp what's actually going on. And so dualism is opposed to the idea of physicalism or materialism that we looked at earlier in this class. Dualism suggests that there is physical stuff but also non-physical stuff, while physicalism and materialism will suggest that no, there's just physical stuff in the world and that's it. The physicalist approach that we'll look at later in this class focuses on the mind being a purely physical thing, such as the brain, that works in a certain way, and we'll cover that stuff later. And so there are many arguments for dualism. Descartes, we looked at Descartes earlier in the semester, and Descartes makes some of the better arguments for dualism. And there's four that we're going to look at in particular. the intuitive plausibility argument, the conceivability argument, the indivisibility argument, and just the argument against physicalism as a philosophy. And so through these four arguments, we start to get the understanding or start to see where Descartes is coming from in his idea that physical stuff and mental stuff are different, and that there is such a thing as a mind, or he believes a soul, which are basically the same for him, that are different from the actual physical world. And so let's take a look at these four different arguments for dualism, and then perhaps come up with some counter arguments or see where we can poke holes in these arguments. First, we have to look at the idea that substance dualism, just in our initial thoughts, is somewhat plausible. It seems as though our minds and bodies have very different properties. Like I mentioned before, our minds are largely non-physical. There's no weight or mass or thing that we can really identify as a physical quality of the mind, while your brain and your bodies do have a weight, they do have a mass, they're extended in space and time, which seems to suggest that they're two very different things. When our bodies are something that are perceived by others or perceivable to others, others can look inside our body, look at our behavior, look at our actions in our brain. He can see using technology and machines if there are tumors on the brain, or is this part of the brain active while other parts are not active. This seems not the same as looking at someone's mental states. When we look at someone's mental states, we're not actually looking at anything particular. It's not something that is perceived by others. Someone can see my behavior and guess at my mental state, but they can't actually see what my mental state is. I could perhaps be acting or not feeling the thing that other people might think I am, because the mental qualities and characteristics of a person are not really perceivable. And so it's just a bit weird that we would suggest that the brain and the mind are the same thing. We're more reluctant to accept that humans are special. There's something to us that is more than just the physical matter that makes us up. And so it's that extra piece, whether it be the soul or just some non-physical thing that makes us who we are, makes us feel that special kind of feeling. And while this isn't the greatest argument, it certainly is probably one of the more convincing arguments for substance dualism. Just the idea that it seems as though mind and matter are two very different things. The next argument is an argument that Descartes puts forward in his meditations that you're going to be reading for this particular lecture. And it's known as the conceivability argument. And the conceivability argument goes as follows. I can clearly and distinctly think of my mind existing without my body. It is conceivable that my mind could have existed without my body. It is possible for my mind to exist without my body. Therefore, my mind and my body are distinct. Now, this is a fairly confusing argument that Descartes puts forward. And it's confusing because he's not necessarily saying that anything that he can conceive of is in fact real or exists. All he's saying here is that if he can distinctly think of his mind and body existing as two separate things, then it must be the case that they are two separate things. Because if they were only one thing, we wouldn't be able to conceive of them being separate. And the reason he thinks that that's the case is because logically, it's impossible to think of one thing as being two things distinctly. So just as I can't think of a three-sided square, I also can't think of my mind existing without my body if, in fact, they are the same thing. And I'd ask you to try and do this. Look around the room that you're in right now. Pick an object out and think to yourself, can I conceive of this object without the quality of this object? I know it's difficult to explain. For instance, I'm looking at a surfboard right now. And I'm looking at this surfboard and I'm thinking to myself, can I have a distinct separation between the surfboard and the surfboardedness that it encompasses, right? I can't have the surfboardness without the surfboard. And I can't have the surfboard without a surfboardness, right? There's not two things there. There are parts of a surfboard. There are the fins and the leash and the pad. But in terms of just the surfboard, I can't turn it into two things. I can't imagine the surfboard being without the surfboard. However, I can imagine, or Descartes can imagine, the mind existing without the body. Or if it's difficult for you to think of the mind existing without the body, try to think of the body existing without the mind. We often refer to this as a philosophical zombie, a person that walks around and acts just like we act, responds to stimuli just like we respond to stimuli. However, there's nothing conscious going on in the zombie's mind because there is no mind. And so when I think of the body and I think of the mind, I can kind of see that they can exist independently of one another. Again, when I think of perhaps the mind existing without the body, I can think of kind of a spiritual entity, something that exists without a body but exists in non-physical spiritual form. And so when Descartes is asking us to conceive of an object, he's almost tricking us into believing, well, if you accept premise one, then you must therefore accept the conclusion, because logically the conclusion has to follow. Because if one thing can be two, then it's always two and never one. And it couldn't be two if it were only one. The next argument that Descartes expresses in his meditations is the indivisibility argument. Now, the indivisibility argument goes as follows. Bodies are extended in space and physically located. Anything that is physically extended is also divisible. Minds are essentially indivisible or unified. Therefore, the mind is not the same thing as a body. Here again, he's identifying the characteristics and qualities of a mind and the characteristics and qualities of a body, and suggesting that bodies, brains, have extension in space and time. They're physically located and divisible. If I am holding a brain in my hand, I can easily cut the brain in half into a left and a right hemisphere. And so that physical thing is divisible. Now, a mind, however, is not something that I can hold in my hand necessarily. Again, the qualities and characteristics of a mind are that it is where we have emotions. It is something that allows us to anticipate, to daydream, to wonder, to feel, to plan. And this level of consciousness doesn't seem like it's something that I can really hold or pick up. It's not something that's physically there. And so if it's not physically there, it doesn't seem like I can divide it in any way. I can't cut it in half the way I cut a brain in half into the left and the right hemisphere. And so if the mind is not something that's physically located and therefore not something that's divisible, it must therefore be different from the body. And so we have the two substances, the divisible mind, the divisible body, and the indivisible mind. The last of the arguments is the argument against physicalism. And this is going to be another pretty good argument that we're still having trouble with today when we think of the mind-body problem. Essentially, there is a difficulty in explaining the mind and the body in physical terms because there are a lot of problems that go into just a purely physical or purely material world. Think back to the earlier class where we dealt with metaphysics. Is it the case that the world is just made up of material stuff? Or is the world made up of both material and non-material stuff? If it's made up of material and non-material stuff, then the argument against physicalism, the arguments that are against physicalism might suggest that dualism or substance dualism is the better way to go. There are quite a few problems with all of these theories, however. And the first is going to be the oddity problem. Going back to both the conceivability and the indivisibility argument, Descartes asks us to conceive of the mind existing separate from the body. But can we in fact really do this? Can I imagine the mind existing as a separate thing from the body? When I try to think of the mind existing without the body, my mind often goes to thinking of spirits or ghosts. But even spirits or ghosts seem to have some body. There's some shape to them. Even though they're not physical in the sense that I can touch them the same as I can touch the sunglasses on my desk, I can see a shape and a size roughly. And so while trying to conceive of a non-physical thing, I often have to use physical criteria to really even imagine that. And so it's not quite clear that I can accurately conceive of my mind existing without my body. Same thing goes for existing of your body existing without your mind. The philosophical zombie, a person who responds to stimuli but has no conscious activity going for them, to me it seems as though if you're able to respond to stimuli and hold intelligent conversations and exist as you were in the world, then it would be the case that that is all that we're really doing, both humans and animals alike. And so to suggest that the body can exist without the mind, again, seems very difficult to conceive. And so for us to suggest that the mind and the body are separate just because we can conceive of them differently, well, it's not necessarily clear that we can in fact conceive of them differently. Now, going back to the indivisibility argument, when we think of something that's located in space and time, we think of our brain, we can locate it in space and time, we can divide it by cutting it in half. However, it seems as though we can also cut the mind into pieces. We often talk about different aspects of the mind, the memory, the language, the creativity aspect of the mind, it seems to be different parts of the mind. And so while we may not be able to necessarily hold the mind, it certainly is just as divisible as the body is. And in fact, there is this link between mind and body where when the body is divided, when the brain is divided, the mind seems to get divided as well. There are certain aspects that are lost, and so the mind being divisible seems like it could be a possibility as well. If I were to get a lobotomy, for instance, and have the right hemisphere of my brain removed, I would lose a lot of mental capacities that are required by my right side of the brain. So it would seem as though these two things are both present and divisible. And so it's not necessarily the case that they are different things or made up of different stuff. And then we have the causal interaction problem, which is not the causal interaction problem, it is the causal interaction problem. And when we think of the causal interaction problem, we're really understanding how the brain and the mind can affect each other. If you have a substance if you have a physical substance and a non-physical substance, how is it that the physical affects the non-physical, and how is it that the non-physical affects the physical? Now, we know that there is a cause and effect relationship between the mind and the brain. Like I mentioned before, if I were to get a lobotomy, my mind would be affected by the procedure. So the mind is affected by the body of the brain. On the flip side, it seems to be the case, and is the case, I guess, that when we start to think and conceive of certain things, it affects the way our body works. For instance, if I'm worrying and stressing over a test, it might be the case that I start to get a stomach ache, I start to sweat or get red or start to feel sick. And these are instances where purely mental activities affect the physical body. And so it's important to see that with Descartes, he really dealt with this causal interaction problem by suggesting that, oh no, there is in fact a part of the brain that allows these two pieces to connect, and it's the pineal gland in the brain. Now remember, Descartes wrote in the 1600s, and while this may have been scientific for them then, it certainly isn't now. And we know through science and the development of technology that the pineal gland in the brain is not where mind and body are connected, but instead deal with something else that's pretty understandable by us today. The next problem with this idea of substance dualism is the problem of evolving minds. If, in fact, there is both physical stuff and non-physical stuff, and the mind is made up of non-physical stuff, then how is it that a minded creature evolved from a non-minded creature? So if we take evolution to be true, and humans evolved from other creatures, and humans have minds, but suggests that other creatures may not necessarily have minds, or even from the things prior to even animals or insects existing. So if we take our evolution from just pure atoms and energy in the universe, it's not the case that there is some conscious level of understanding or thinking or emoting going on between protons and neutrons. Instead, these seem to be just purely physical things existing in the world, moving around. through energy and in relation to one another. And so through our evolution, we see that this physical stuff has given rise to what we are today. And what we are today is a thinking creature, something that can emote, something that can feel and anticipate and desire and believe and have all of these other mental phenomena going on. And so if we're to suggest that evolution is the case, then how is it that a mental creature or a creature that has a mind evolved from things that didn't have a mind? It doesn't seem as though there is that connection to be drawn, and so we might suggest that, well, no, the world is just purely physical. There is not multiple substances out there. There are, of course, responses to some of these objections, however. Parallelism is one of them, and is kind of a scapegoat example where God has just set up a pre-established harmony between physical and mental happenings or things in the world. I can't really explain how the mind and the body interacts or cause and affect one another, but it's just the way that the system was set up, and that's how it is. There isn't much proof to this argument. However, it is something that could be suggested and looked further into if we were to really understand what this harmony and precondition of our existence is. The other response can be the response of epiphenomenalism, and that minds are causally impotent, meaning that minds come about through brains, but brains don't come about through minds. And so minds can't make changes in the physical world the way that physical things can make changes in that mental world. And so all change occurs at the physical level, but then that affects how the mind works. And so the mind arises from the physical brain, but not the other way around. And so here we can see an instance of, right, when your brain becomes so complex like a human's brain is, then the mind is created from that. And things that don't have a complicated brain will have less or no mental phenomenon or mind. The last response is one of interactionism. And interactionism is just going back to that idea mentioned earlier of how do these things, mental and physical, interact with one another. While Descartes thinks it's the pineal gland, we know now that that's not really the case. And in fact, we're still left wondering, how is it that your brain and your mind work together? Because it seems as though they do. There are plenty of instances where this is the case, as I mentioned before, with the nervousness of taking a test and the reaction of having a stomach ache versus me getting a lobotomy and then having the mental capacity, my mental capacity halved after that. And so one of the biggest critiques to Descartes, and one that is often referred to when thinking of Descartes' substance dualism, is Gilbert Ryle's category mistake. And so Gilbert Ryle, in one of his papers, writes that Descartes makes this category mistake, essentially treating two entities as the same logical type when they're really two different sorts of things. And so If two entities are the same logical type, then the same sorts of things can be true of them. So for instance, I can say that apples are the color red and cars are the color blue, right? So now we have red apples, blue cars, and I can speak of both being colored because they're of the same logical type. They're both objects in the world. Now, if I take something that's a different logical type, you'll see that we can't attribute the same types of qualities to them. For instance, Fridays are red and numbers are blue. Now, Fridays and numbers are not of the same type of things as apples and cars. This doesn't, however, make Fridays and numbers any less real. They're just different ways of looking at things. There's a different logical type. Fridays and numbers aren't like they don't have substance to them because they're ideas rather than actual things in the world that have weight and mass and shape and color and so forth. So to suggest that Fridays and numbers are colored, since that doesn't make sense, I can't then go ahead and say, well, apples are in the physical world and Fridays are not in the physical world. Fridays are not their own substance. Fridays are just a way in which it's just a label in which we understand certain things, certain physical entities. For instance, if I have a calendar, right, knowing what day is coming up, where the sun is located, I'll know whether or not it's Friday or June or winter, even though those things aren't actually physical. Now, the example that Gilbert Ryle uses in his paper is a boy who walks around a university. So imagine taking a tour of a university, and you're shown the gymnasium, you're shown the arts and humanities building, you're shown the math building and the English building, you're shown admissions and different administration buildings, the theater. And so you're shown all around campus, and then as the tour is winding down, you turn to the tour guide and ask, those buildings were nice and all, but where is the university? Now, here we seem to see that the thing we're thinking of is of two different types, just like Descartes believes that the mind and the brain are of two different types. And so we can't suggest that they have the same qualities because they're two different types of thing. The university buildings are the physical structures that you can walk in, you can see, that have size. The university, on the other hand, is merely a concept, an idea of how we connect the behavior of these buildings together. So when these buildings work in the way that they're supposed to, you end up creating a system, an organization that is the university. So of course we can't talk of the university as being identical to the buildings because they're of two different kinds. And so when Descartes suggests that the mind has these qualities and the brain has these other qualities, this is also a category mistake where he's suggesting that these two things of different types should have the same qualities, otherwise they're different things. When in reality, because they're two different types of thing, of course they'll have different qualities. But just because they're two different types of thing doesn't make one a substance and the other not a substance. It's how we classify and organize substances that make the mind or the university what it is. And so Gilbert Ryle will respond to Descartes by putting forth his own understanding of the mind-body problem by suggesting that Now, the mind and the body are the same thing. The mind is the body. But when we think of the mind, we're thinking of it in a different logical type. Really, what the mind is how all the parts of the brain behave together. And so Ryle creates this idea of the philosophy of mind by suggesting behaviorism is the answer to the mind-body problem. That all that a mind is how the body behaves. And this is something that we're going to be looking into a little bit next lecture, as well as the physicality and identicalness of the mind and the body.